In today's video, we're diving into two true caving stories that ended in suffocating horror. In the first, a seasoned instructor becomes pinned nearly 600 meters underground in Italy, trapped in darkness as rescuers fight to reach her. In the second, 6 explorers vanish deep beneath the Yorkshire hills, swallowed by a sudden flood and trapped in tunnels that close in around them. Both would struggle for air, for freedom, and lose. These are not stories of survival. These are stories of being buried alive while still awake. As always, viewer discretion is advised. It was a cold December morning in northern Italy. 32-year-old Ottavia Piana zipped up her thermal caving suit, strapped on her helmet lamp, and double-checked her harness. She wasn't a tourist or an amateur thrill seeker. Ottavia was a seasoned instructor, someone who had spent years guiding others through the underground world. Her destination was Bueno Fonteno Cave, a vast and twisting network hidden in the limestone hills near Lake Iseo in the province of Bergamo. Parts of it had been mapped, much of it had not. For cavers, that meant challenge and possibility. She and a small team descended into the entrance, moving from damp stone corridors into belly-scraping squeezes. Above ground, the sun still shone over the snowy peaks. Deep below, they were stepping into another world, one where daylight could never follow. Hours into the expedition, the team had reached a depth of nearly 585 meters, more than half a kilometer under solid rock. The air was cooler now, heavy with the smell of wet earth. The tunnel they were in narrowed sharply, forcing Ottavia to move carefully, planting her boots against slick stone as she edged forward. Then, a misstep. Her foot slid on a patch of mud. The narrow chute funneled her downward, and she fell hard, the sharp crack of bone echoing in the confined space. Pain surged through her leg, a serious fracture. She was pinned in a space barely wide enough to turn her head, with hundreds of meters of rock between her and the surface. Moving on her own was impossible. Even bending to touch her injured leg sent waves of pain through her body. The team called for help immediately, but in a cave like this, help was hours, if not days, away. The realization began to set in. She was trapped, and the clock was ticking. The beam from Ottavia's helmet lamp barely cut through the darkness ahead. The walls pressed in close on both sides, dripping with cold water. Every sound seemed magnified. Her own breathing, the slow trickle of groundwater, the faint rustle of ropes as her teammates moved nearby. Pain pulsed through her leg in hot waves, each throb sharper than the last. She tried shifting her position, but the fracture sent a spike of agony up her body, forcing her to stop. The rock felt colder now. She knew how dangerous her situation was. At this depth, rescue was never quick. Stretcher extractions through narrow squeezes could take days, even for uninjured people. And here, the passages twisted like a knotted rope, some barely wide enough for a single person to crawl through. Her teammates kept their voices steady, but Ottavia could hear the tension underneath. She asked them for water, for updates, for anything to help measure the hours. But the silence between those updates seemed to stretch longer each time. Above her, in the winter night, rescuers were already assembling. But deep underground, time passed differently, slower, heavier, as she lay in the cold stone cradle of the earth, waiting for the sound of salvation. By nightfall, the rescue was underway. More than 100 specialists from Italy's Alpine and Speleological Rescue Corps assembled at the cave mouth. They brought ropes, pulleys, medical supplies, and the kind of quiet focus that comes from knowing one wrong move underground can make a bad situation fatal. Getting to Ottavia wasn't simply a matter of walking in. At 585 meters down, the path wound through tight corkscrew passages, steep drops, and sharp turns. In some places, the rescuers had to lie flat and inch forward on their stomachs. In others, they had to widen the rock itself, using small controlled charges and drills to create space for a stretcher to pass. Each trip to her location could take more than 8 hours, and then the same time again to climb back out. Teams rotated in shifts, ferrying medical supplies, hot drinks, and words of encouragement. Medics stabilized her fracture and wrapped her leg to prevent further damage, but moving her was still impossible until the route was fully prepared. Above ground, the media began gathering. The story of a young woman trapped deep in a mountain spread fast. Below, the rescuers pressed on in the icy dark, their helmet lights bobbing like fireflies in a tunnel that seemed to go on forever. 48 hours after her fall, the last obstacle between Ottavia and the surface was finally cleared. The rescuers slid the stretcher into position, its narrow frame barely fitting through the widened passage. Ottavia's face was pale, her breath shallow, but she managed a weak smile when the lead medic told her it was time to go home. Carefully, they strapped her in, padding every angle to protect her fractured leg. The ascent was grueling. At each vertical shaft, the stretcher had to be hauled up by a coordinated team, passing hand over hand through gaps so small that at times even the rescuers could barely squeeze by. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and condensation dripped constantly from the rock above. Hours passed in a rhythm of movement and pause, movement and pause. The rescuers' voices echoed in the blackness, short commands, steady and calm. Ottavia stayed quiet, conserving her energy, feeling the subtle change in air as they drew closer to the surface. And then, daylight. A narrow slice at first, then the full rush of cold winter air on her face as they emerged from the cave mouth. Applause and shouts erupted from the gathered crowd. Wrapped in a thermal blanket, she was carried to a waiting ambulance. She had survived, but the cave had left its mark, a memory etched in darkness, in stone, and in pain. Ottavia's rescue was hailed as a triumph, proof of skill, coordination, and sheer human will. In the days that followed, the caving community spoke about her calm under pressure, her ability to endure in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. But survival in a place like Bueno Fonteno Cave is never guaranteed. For every story that ends in daylight and applause, there are others that end in silence. The rock does not care who you are, how prepared you might be, or how much life you still have ahead. Ottavia was lucky, others are not. She walked out of the mountain alive, but in Yorkshire, 1967, 6 young explorers never came back. Their story begins on a summer's day in a cave that seemed calm until the first drops of rain began to fall. It was June 24th, 1967. 10 cavers, most of them young, fit, and experienced, gathered at the entrance to Mossdale Caverns. The cave was infamous in the British caving community, a sprawling system of low crawlways, chest-deep pools, and tight underwater squeezes. Not a place for beginners. That weekend, the weather was warm, the skies mostly clear. A few clouds drifted above the rolling green hills. There was no reason to think the trip would be anything but a challenge and a thrill. The group split early in the journey. 4 stayed in the safer entrance series, while 6 pushed deeper into the far marathon crawls, a twisting set of tunnels nearly a mile from daylight. What they didn't know was that miles away, a storm was building, one that would decide their fate. Mossdale Caverns had always carried a warning among cavers: enter only in perfect weather. The system was one of the longest and most dangerous in Britain, with over 6 miles of mapped passages, and many more believed to be unexplored. Its biggest threat wasn't falling rock or getting lost, it was water. Rain on the surface could surge into the cave within minutes, funneled from miles of surrounding hills straight into its narrowest crawlways. In dry conditions, it was a test of skill and stamina. In wet conditions, it was a trap. And in June 1967, those warnings weren't enough to stop disaster. The 6 cavers in the advance group moved quickly. They were led by Dave Adamson, a skilled leader who knew Mossdale well. They belly-crawled through ankle-deep water, their helmets scraping the ceiling. The passages narrowed into choke points, barely wider than a man's shoulders. Every turn meant twisting their bodies sideways, pushing their packs ahead of them. It was slow, wet, exhausting work, but to this team, it was all part of the challenge. After more than an hour underground, they reached Rough Chamber, a small junction where multiple wet crawlways branched off. Here, they paused, adjusting lamps and swapping quick jokes before pressing deeper into the far reaches of the system. Above ground, the first drops of rain were starting to fall. The Yorkshire dales are riddled with sinkholes and swallow holes, places where surface rainwater vanishes directly underground. Mossdale Caverns is fed by many of them. When the storm hit, water began pouring into the cave's entrance series in minutes, funneling through tight chutes toward the deeper chambers. In the far marathon crawls, the team didn't know it yet, but their route back was vanishing. The water rose fast, turning ankle-deep pools into chest-deep torrents. The roar of rushing water grew louder, echoing through the rock. Passages that had been open minutes earlier were now blocked by siphons, completely flooded sections with no airspace. The 6 cavers were now cut off, trapped more than a mile from the surface, with the flood chasing them through a maze of rock barely big enough to breathe in. When the 4 cavers who had stayed closer to the entrance realized what was happening, they scrambled to get out. Soaked and shaken, they ran for help. By the time rescuers arrived, the storm was still pounding the hills. Floodwater roared into the entrance like a river disappearing into the earth. It was obvious. No one could get in without risking more lives. The system was now a trap filled with fast, freezing water. Rescue teams waited through the night, hoping the flood would drop quickly. But Mossdale is fed by a vast underground drainage network. The water stayed high for over a day. When it finally lowered enough for divers and cavers to re-enter, they moved carefully, knowing another storm could seal their fate as well. In the far marathon crawls, the team found signs of a desperate retreat. Mud disturbed, packs abandoned, scratch marks in the clay. They discovered the bodies in a narrow section called Knee Wrecker Passage. The cavers had tried to climb out against the flood, but the water had closed in on both sides, leaving no airspace. There, in the cold black water, 6 people had drowned, just a few hundred feet from a safer chamber. Recovering them was almost impossible. The crawlways were too tight, the distances too long. The risk of another flood was always looming. In the end, the rescuers left the bodies where they were. Mossdale became both a cave and a grave. The entrance to Mossdale Caverns was sealed with stone and earth. A memorial plaque stands nearby, the names of all 6 cavers etched into metal. They remain where they fell. The rock holds them now. The water that killed them still runs through those same passages whenever the rains come. 2 very different caves, 2 very different dangers. Both remind us, caves are not just empty spaces in the rock. They are living, shifting worlds with their own rules. They demand respect, and sometimes that respect comes too late.